Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I am responding to IMBeggar's video, Why Would God Create a World with So Much Evil and Suffering and Then Allow It to Happen? In this video, IMBeggar is attempting to provide the answer to the age-old problem of eagle argument against the idea of God being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and everywhere present. This video is only a couple of weeks old, and I was going to respond to it a little bit sooner, but then I saw Mindshift came out with a video on it, and I decided to let him have the early thunder on this one, and that I would think about it a little bit more and give a different response. His video is a great one. I'll leave it in the description, but there's a lot of things that he doesn't address that because of who I am and my experience and my view of looking at this more theologically, I think I will do a very different video than Mindshift did. And because of this, I kind of changed my approach as someone who is more of an atheist theologian of sorts, who analyzes the theology of an argument, as well as if it works philosophically. Plus, I also have a lot of experiences in dealing practically with the problem of evil, which kind of will play into my response to this video. It causes, the problem of evil causes people to question their faith, and for good reason. I am, in keeping with the goals of this channel, not only going to point out the flaws with this apologist response to the problem of evil, I'm also going to use it to push you over the edge to unbelief. Don't worry, it'll be good for you, but let's roll.
We give God a lot of heat for creating a world with so much evil and suffering, and then allowing it all to happen.
Yep, I must compliment IMBeggar for two things right out the gate. For his animation and graphics. They are very, very good, and it's one of the real high things about this video is he does a very good job of using physical illustrations to illustrate his points. So his points are very clear. I'm just going to point out that they're not very good ones. This is probably also, number two, the most succinct and complete statement of the problem of evil I've seen, using the visual with all the words and everything. Unlike many other apologists, he's bringing in both natural and moral evil all at once. Well done. A lot of people, many of the people I've responded to with the problem of evil in the past have either brought it without really addressing the natural evil question, or when it comes to moral evil, they talk about suffering rather than morally evil choices. But IMBeggar doesn't avoid that, so well done.
But I would bet if you were to create your own little world, you would have made it the exact same way, and you wouldn't want it any other way.
Oh, challenge accepted. Sorry, I would absolutely eliminate moral and natural evil if I could. I've seen too much of it, and some of it is absolutely negative impact on human beings and society. That said, this is a unique response in some ways, but not completely. But in any case, challenge accepted, because there are some definite changes I would make in how this world is. But let's go.
Now bear with me here on a little bit of an analogy, and I promise it'll all come together in the end. And stick around, because I'm going to ask you some questions that I think will really...
Oh, I like quizzes, and I do notice the little I hope there in the animation, so way to prepare your audience for the possibility of a letdown. So on the one hand, you confidently assert I wouldn't want to do it any other way, but then offer a caveat with a little I hope message. But okay, enough delays, let's get into it.
As I'm sure you all know by now, AI has gotten so advanced, you can have a full-on conversation with this thing and not even know you're talking to a bot. And I'm sure you also know that all AI has to be pre-programmed with thousands of protocols to prevent it from, say, taking over the world, starting World War III, or enslaving all of humanity. So in other words, all AI is pre-programmed to serve and do no harm, or to do good and avoid evil. Okay, so imagine the greatest AI engineers on the planet all getting together and saying, let's try to create not the perfect intelligence, but intelligence that is good. So they thought, let's create a simulated world that acts and behaves just like our own, and populate it with millions of these bots who look like us, act like us, and have to live, work, and survive together, just like we do. And of course the engineers had absolute control over every aspect of this planet, from time and space down to the tiniest little detail, and absolute control over every bot in it.
Well, that would put the engineers in a very powerful position to control a lot of factors. Their goal is to have good intelligence, not necessarily perfect intelligence, which is an interesting thing and very subjective. I have to point out this point that yes, those terms are very subjective. Perfect and what a person would consider to be perfect is very subjective. As if you ask people what perfect anything is, they will give multiple answers to it, not just one. The same is true idea for good morality. What do you mean by that? So what we're left with is, it's not about the bot's understanding, which you will propose is understanding of good and perfect. It's about the engineer's understanding of what is good and perfect. That's what matters. And it really doesn't matter at this point what other engineers would define these ideas as, because at this point, all that matters is what they think these terms mean. The bots have no say, nor the other possible engineers. I like the reference to the Trinity as well in the engineers. I mean, you stuck with 3 of them, huh? You thought you snuck that in there, but as a former theologian, I know this. But let's continue.
Now, in this first world, every single bot was pre-programmed with the thousands of protocols, now perfected, to do good and avoid evil. So in other words, every single bot was incapable of making any wrong choices, and only able to make right ones. Now, what do you think we would observe in this first world? Well, it was the perfect world.
Perfect according to who? The subjective idea of perfect kicks you already. We haven't got to your explanation, and I'm wondering if you thought about how this could be viewed by a different group of engineers. But the big thing so far is the false notion that all choices that are either purely morally good, one direction, or morally evil. There is no notion that some decisions could not be better than others morally, that good decisions could have some variance in how good they are, that even if the bots could only make good decisions that did good or didn't do any harm, that the idea of which is the better choice would still be present. There'd still be choices about what level of good we're aiming for, what level of perfect we're aiming for, and those are all subjective terms anyway. That a bot has good choice A, good choice B, and good choice C in front of them still requires them to make a decision, but only has the time and resources perhaps to do one would still create a problem or an issue. You can get rid of moral evil at this point and still, provide a lot of different options as to which choice is the best morally. And from an efficiency point of view, what one is most efficiently and the best choice for the situation.
Every bot did exactly what it was programmed to do, and the protocols worked perfectly. They advanced incredibly fast and learned how to provide for themselves and for each other, and not one bot was in need. And since they were incapable of making any wrong choices, there were no wars, no poverty, no oppression, and no evil, and no suffering. The world was all very clean, shiny, peaceful, prosperous, well-ordered, super advanced, and boring.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Boring is a subjective value judgment. I wanted to point out the obvious here, that this is the engineers getting bored with their creation. But it works, so no problems to solve. Basically, the engineers are saying, wow, this works so well, it's become boring, and therefore we need to figure out a way to not make it be boring. Such a world would give little for engineers to do, I guess. And so because of that, we got to inject a little suffering evil so it's a bit more exciting. A few observations. What a privileged thing to say. And it tells me, IMBeggar, that you haven't had to deal with the real issues of suffering ever in your life. You've lived a very privileged life, and sorry, at that point, the idea that this world is going to be boring, that's your defense, that we need to discard this world because it's boring. I mean, that doesn't work emotionally either. Let me give you a couple scenarios and see if this is a good counseling move. These are actual situations that I have faced in my ministry when I was actually still a believer and trying to deal with the problem of evil in practical real life. I had a woman dying of cancer once. She was 45 years old. In her last moment, she was not herself. She was literally like a trapped animal looking around, gasping for her last breath. And as I held her hand, I actually felt the moment when she died and life left her body. I can't say that at that moment I would have said to her, if she could have understood me, which I don't think she could have at that moment, or to her family members, well, this is all really necessary because otherwise it would be really boring. Going to a funeral of a small child or a young child, I've done that too. And I doubt very much that I would have consoled the family, these kids dying at an early age, it makes life exciting. That's just very callous. It's a very callous thing to say that somebody that's lost a child. And I also had to deal with online a counseling session with a man who had lost his entire family in the Katrina hurricane. At that moment saying, if you hadn't lost all your family, the world would be kind of boring if you got to continue to love them and care for them long term. What a shallow reason to dismiss this world as it's just boring. Sorry, I'd rather have boring than some of the crap that I've had to deal with in the ministry and since. The thing is, though, this perfect world, it's pretty analogous to a good description of what heaven is supposed to be like to many theologians. But more on that in a moment.
They noticed all the bots more or less acted the same and fell into very predictable patterns, like a fine-tuned machine. So yeah, they created a perfect world, but those in it were not. Because is it really good if you're only doing what you were programmed to do?
Thanks for bringing up the issue of good being subjective again, as we are pointing back to the fact that this is what the engineers think this is. It has nothing to do with the bots or what they feel or think it is. But in your vision of the perfect world, there's an assumption that there would be no struggle, and I think that's a false notion. When you say such things, it tells me that you really haven't thought about what a perfect world would be to different people. Also, in your depiction, you show architecture has developed, science has developed, which shows growth over time, and this indicates that there are still problems to solve and things to judge as far as which would be more effective. I'm not sure you get a well-ordered machine here either, but one that is actively dealing with different issues of value without unnecessary evil and suffering. This is the world you would have to postulate in order to say Adam and Eve's fall was a bad thing. But if you say that a greater good can be achieved through suffering and moral evil, then you fall away from this perfect world was better, as if Adam and Eve had obeyed, there would have led to a better outcome. In order to say the fall is a fall and a bad choice, you have to say that the other alternative was a better choice. But you're already going down the path that the opposite is true, that God should have pushed Adam and Eve to make the disobedient choice to avoid the perfect world scenario where it's boring, and instead bring evil in as a necessary element in order to develop certain things in humanity. God then at that point needs to bring in evil and cause it so he can get a better result. Your engineers kind of play this out. IMBeggar has already laid his cards out on the table at this point by declaring such a world as boring and tries to avoid the idea of it's better to throw in evil and suffering to get something better. But in so doing, he introduces the idea that Adam and Eve being obedient would have led to a lesser world than the one that we have right now, and he throws that completely in our face. But then again, this is a good depiction of what people think heaven would be like, and the way the Bible describes it. No sin, no wars, no suffering, no evil, no more tears. Is this not what heaven is going to be? Perfect, and according to him, boring? I also have to comment at this point that the bots have their needs met is also a value judgment. And even in a world where moral and natural evils do not exist, there would still be some needs that humans and in this case bots would have, and would still require time and decisions to actualize. We could, if we are using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, think of a world presented here that the needs eventually do become met very quickly. Physical needs are going to be met very quickly. Food, clothing, shelter, reproduction, things are like that, oxygen, are all going to be met very quickly, and everybody's going to work hard to make sure that they're met. But we still have issues of scarcity that would still require us to make value judgments on which resources do we want to continue to move forward with. Security and safety needs, yeah, those needs are met too because there's really no threat from moral evil. But you haven't really talked about natural evil. If the world is still the same as you postulate in this video, then wouldn't there also not be natural evil still existent? Also, at the point of Maslow's hierarchy of belonging and love, yeah, trust levels would be higher in a world where you know that nobody's going to swerve you or harm you. But does that eliminate the need for relationships to grow and decisions of what the best course of action for those relationships to grow wouldn't be there? Personalities would be different. Goals and objectives are going to be subjectively different to each person or bot. There's a lot of options here, but you would get rid of the trust issues, but there's a whole packle of issues that are still going to remain. The issue of time and how many relationships a person has the capacity to have remains. Self-esteem needs would still be there. What this would be like would be different for each bot. Different personalities, starting points, etc. would make this different. And the idea of friendly competition would still exist to help that process. Respect, confidence, achievement would all still exist and require different fields depending on the individual. Self-actualization needs, of course, would also still be there. This would also be different for each bot given the subjective desires. This is something that IMBeggar completely ignores. Subjective desires of each bot. He never addresses it as an analogy, and I think it's a fatal flaw. I mean, at least Robert Heinlein in Time Enough for Love addressed the issue of self-actualization with his main character. That even though all the moral evils and suffering evils had kind of been overcome through science and psychology in his world, he still has a character that's lived 3,500 years and at that point says, I'm bored and I want to end it. Okay, is there anything that I haven't done? In other words, self-actualization as a need would be constantly evolving the longer people lived. And it would be constantly changing as to what that need would always remain in front of a limited human beings that are limited in their knowledge, limited in their power, and limited in their ability to be only one place at one time. I say all this to say that IMBeggar really hasn't thought through as much about this perfect world, and he really seems to think that such a world doesn't have options and multiple ending possibilities. I would also say that this derails his argument at this point, as he really hasn't thought out the different directions such a world would go, and how each bot programmed in it with its own personality desires, how he individually could still be preserved and would probably very definitely exist and inherently exist. And now I'm not sure that the higher needs could achieve his machine-like quality he thinks would exist. There are many different ends for such a world, and not just the machine-like world that IMBeggar proposes. This is why I think the rest of the video is flawed and already has gone off the rails, actually responding to the problem of evil. He is basically already saying the fall of Adam and Eve wouldn't have been a bad thing because it gives great opportunity for greater good, which he's going to re-emphasize many, many times in the rest of the video. And there's an assumption that things would always end up the same if there was no moral choice about it, that somehow magically there wouldn't be any challenges to human existence given that we're finite. That is simply not true, as there would be issues that do not involve overcoming evil, but do require choices, and respect for individual needs of his self-esteem and self-actualization would still be varied and change over time. I'm not going to try to interrupt too much more from now on because I kind of laid the groundwork. I mean, just assume everything I said as you watch, and you'll see how it breaks down.
So the engineers thought, let's do something crazy here. Let's rerun the same simulation, but this time, let's only write the protocols into their memories, so they know what's right or wrong, but give them the choice to follow them or not, essentially giving them freedom. What do you think we would observe in this world? Well, as I'm sure you can imagine, it didn't take long for the first bot to break protocol, and from there, all hell broke loose. This bot took advantage of that bot, these bots oppressed those bots rose up against these bots, and the great historical pendulum between the master-slave, the have-nots, began. Which of course led to every form of war, poverty, slavery, hatred, hedonism, and the most unspeakable evils that even the engineers could never have imagined. And amidst all this newfound squalor, chaos, and confusion, they noticed something else. Cracks emerged in the actual system. Bugs, breakdowns, glitches in the code, system-wide viruses that wiped out generations. Or in other words, what we would call disease. And the metrics of evil and suffering skyrocketed. This discouraged the engineers. But drilling down into the analytics a little deeper, they saw something else. Interwoven between all the spikes of evil and suffering, they saw spikes of goodness, real chosen goodness, sometimes even hero status greatness. And as the metrics of evil and suffering increased, so did this goodness. So despite all the evil and suffering, some of the bots still chose to be good. And that's what the engineers set out to design. But that wasn't all. Blossoming out of the struggle, they saw something that was completely absent from the first world. Identity. Individuality, personality, character emerged, leading to expressions of art and culture. And in seeking solutions to all their problems and suffering, the search for truth and meaning began, leading to forms of religion and philosophy, which exploded into science and technology. And while they were nowhere near as advanced as they were in the first world, at least in this world they could say, we did it on our own.
What?
A few issues at this point. The engineers couldn't have imagined. So the engineers at this point are very unlike the biblical God or the omni-God proposed. And so you're already off the problem of evil issue with the all-knowledge part of God. By definition, knows the outcomes of every action. So there's really actually no need to play out every scenario for God, the omni-God, to know things. But the engineers don't seem to have that ability. So the analogy is starting to break down pretty fast and pretty hard already. And the main issue of the problem of evil is being avoided. Secondly, individually and all those things could still exist in your first world. Subjective desires in the first world would still exist. Different personalities, different higher needs. This would be different for each person. They would still exist. And because people live a long life with no death, this is going to continue to remain a challenge as they go older and get bigger. Culture, art, entertainment, philosophy, and science would all still be required to development in your first world in order for that perfect world to develop. You literally show pictures of advanced skyscrapers, gardening, horticulture, architecture, and somehow think that none of that would have developed in a perfect world, while at the same time saying that it would have had to in order to get the perfect world. Even though people are not allowed to make evil choices in your world 1.1, they're still ignorant of a lot of things. They still need to learn the truth to build a perfect world. And they would learn culture and art to express their subjective human experiences in doing that, in the development of all these things. Your perfect world still has all these things. I would assume scientific development is still a process and has to progress. So we go from wheels on carts to ground cars to flying cars. All this would require development of science and philosophy, which in turn would inspire the development of cultural and artistic expression. Sorry, in the first world you would still get individuality and a more advanced society at the same time. It's a false dichotomy that this is the choice that I have to make between these two worlds. It really shows you haven't really thought it through.
Now, this world wasn't perfect, far from it. But at least those in it were free to be. Now, the engineers found themselves becoming totally enamored by their new creations. But as a result, there was some pushback. We just created a very cruel and unfair world, some argued. And millions of the good that we hope to create are just being wasted every day. So the engineers thought, let's see if we can come up with a way to mitigate all the evil and suffering while still allowing their freedom. So for the first idea, they thought, we already monitor all their thoughts. So anytime anyone's about to make a really bad choice, the system will just intervene and will either edit or overwrite the choice. This way they're still free, just on a very short leash. Well, this turned out to be a humongous-sized disaster. They quickly learned that overwriting some of the choices was far worse than not allowing any. And to change that one choice, they had to change the thousands of choices that led to that one choice, which often meant rewriting entire life stories for multiple bots through multiple generations. Let's just say this caused such severe brain damage and complete system crashes that the engineers vowed never to touch the code of an individual's mind ever again.
Well, firstly, it's weird that the engineers are enamored with this cruel world. They're in love with it. It's interesting to you that the engineers seem to think that the unfair world is something that they should fall in love with. It means it thinks that it's okay that a certain amount of death, evil, disease, unnecessary suffering, etc. is necessary to get their results. He certainly likes to, this is all in line with the God Yahweh in the Old Testament. He certainly likes to flex his muscle and actually involve himself in the killing of people to keep things entertaining. Seems strange to me that the whole point of this world is simply so the engineers can give themselves a high five about freedom, while at the same time they have no empathy for the death or the suffering of the other bots that actually have no opportunity to reach this greater level of good because they die early. Unless you read the Bible and you see also that this is the case with the God Yahweh, then I guess it's okay. 2, you also build on the fact the engineers would have to go back and change the life story of every bot, while at the same time ignoring the fact that death gets rid of a lot of the bots where they don't have a life story in the first place. But then you also say that the God is not going to touch the code again in the end, but isn't he going to touch the code in the end? I have to say that the perfect world is analogous to heaven. So once the saints get there, in order to maintain it, they're going to have to make sure sin never comes into the world again. God is going to have to take away your free will for that to happen. And you're going to have to end up being a people that can only make morally good choices and not evil ones.
For the second idea, they thought, rather than intervening on the choice, let's just quietly and simply intervene on the bad consequence of that choice without touching anyone's freedom. For example, altering the paths of bullets, sprouting fruit trees in the desert, or stopping the disease at its outset. This idea, though promising at first, had some unforeseen consequences. First, it eliminated responsibility. After intervening on the millions of bad things that happen every single day, the engineers decided this isn't helping them. They have to learn to help themselves. And on the flip side, by just removing all the really serious things that could ever happen to anyone in a lifetime, it created for a very basic intelligence. There was no strength because there was nothing to overcome. There was no victory because there were no battles. And there was no greatness because there was no adversity. So as much as it pained them, the engineers decided that removing trial and adversity from the AI was like removing the hammer and fire from a sword. So the engineers concluded it had to be all or nothing. Either they themselves had absolute control and took on all the responsibility, or the bots had absolute freedom and had to take responsibility for themselves and for each other.
This is simply not true, as without morally evil choice and unnecessary suffering, you would still have things to overcome and struggles to have. If the bots are the same as humans and the world is the same as the world that we live in, ignorance is inherent in the bot, and there's challenges to overcome in the world that would still exist despite the lack of unnecessary suffering. Your assumption that there wouldn't be is a demonstration you really haven't thought through this perfect world scenario. And especially when the perfect world has to be achieved. In other words, humanity goes from its starting point to achieving this perfect world. That's a lot of problems to overcome. That's a lot of thoughts to be made. That's a lot of decisions to be made. They would have to build it. This would require them more than basic intelligence. There's still plenty to overcome. Ignorance, scarcity issues of the world, is if the world is the same as ours. You don't have unlimited resources. There are also problems to get a victory over and to solve. You would also still have greatness as we look to individuals that overcome some of the bigger various problems that still exist. Even in a world without unnecessary suffering, there is still limitations. 1 of the bots, and 2, the world around the bots. This leads to something that video hasn't covered at all so far. How morally evil choices and unnecessary suffering diminish strength by destroying the weak before they even get an opportunity to become strong. The battles also have those who are conquered and enslaved by the victors, as the victors claim the spoils. And in order to be great, our world often requires destroying the less great. So many people just don't get an opportunity because of the evil and the unnecessary suffering that exists to even achieve those things. They don't even start out as a line going across your graph because they get cut off very early. The whole thing really counters what I would consider good virtue ethics as well. A good and true virtue doesn't need an evil to push against. It just needs a challenge, and challenges aren't always evil. A true virtue simply stands on its own as a good without the need of a comparison for evil. I can understand what love is without knowing what hatred is.
But this still left so many unsettled. It's just not fair. The strong push around the weak and get away with it, and the innocent die. What's the point? So they tried one more solution. What if there is a system of absolute justice? That is, everyone gets exactly what they deserve in the end, and everything is made fair. So in this system, every single bot will be responsible for every single mode of choice and action of their entire lives. So all those who chose evil will have to pay for it permanently. And all those who chose good will be rewarded permanently. And for all those who suffered tremendously through no fault of their own, yet remained good, will be reimbursed as if they suffered for 1,000,000 lifetimes. So at the end of every bot's life, no matter how long or short that may be, a log is reviewed of every mode of choice and action of their entire lives. And the criterion for this judgment are the original protocols, written into every bot's memory. And the only leniency they'll be shown will be the same leniency they showed others. Is this fair? Now, if you've made it with me this far, thank you. But just stick with me a little longer, you'll see where I'm going with this. Now, some argued, okay, this is fair, but maybe too fair, brutally fair. They forgot all the protocols. They've created their own. They've racked up way too much debt. No one's going to pass that judgment. And how are they even going to know about any of this? So the engineers decided we'll just have to tell them ourselves. We'll upload ourselves into their world, just as one of them, and live among them. And we will be the perfect embodiment of all the protocols. And we'll tell them everything they need to know, and show them everything they need to see. And we'll forgive all their debts, no matter how much they may be, and whatever punishments they may deserve. We'll take them onto ourselves, in their place. And to make it even easier, through him, we'll open up a permanent connection, through which we can internally communicate and keep all their systems updated. And all they have to do is follow us. But the choice will always be theirs.
With your solution, what happened to responsibility that you thought was so important? I mean, basically, the gospel messages dismisses human responsibility for their actions. You get rid of justice altogether in order to have this arbitrary and capricious decision by a God. Just follow me, and if I think you follow me well enough, you get a get out of jail free card with the engineers basically saying, no problem, we just forgive you if you follow us. How can they genuinely engage the protocols in freedom if you're constantly upgrading their systems as well? I would also say that your system of absolute justice as a solution is flawed, not because it is a bad idea, but just because you make it bad with the assumption that everyone does more evil than good. And that is like your opinion, man. But let's take this quiz, as this is the real part I've been waiting for.
Now it's time for the quiz. I'm going to ask you 10 questions, but I'm going to go through them pretty fast, so pause the video and think about it. The first one's a no-brainer. Which world would you rather live in? A perfect world with no evil and no suffering and no freedom? Or a far from perfect world with lots of evil and suffering, but we're free?
World one, because I think we can achieve more in such a world, and to be fair, this is an adequate picture of heaven, so why wouldn't you want this as well? This isn't Adam and Eve always being obedient leading to paradise, isn't it? But I think the question being a so-called no-brainer is false, as your first world would have variance. In this world, there is no death and unnecessary suffering, but there are still problems for the bots to overcome to build this perfect world, which I still must point out is pretty subjective. But even so, ignorance, the limitations of the bots and the limitation of the universe we live in, would still provide challenges to overcome and to make choices about. The question depends on the false dichotomy of freedom or no freedom, but that is not the reality. In a perfect world, there are plenty of good intentions that are going to require choices as to which the best solution would be. World 1.0 could also be 1.9 and everything in between. There's multiple ways that could play out.
Now this is the tough one. Which world would you rather live in? A world where we're responsible for all our messes, or a world where Big Brother is responsible for all our messes?
False dichotomy, but freedom and responsibility go together, so yes, I want to live in the first world, but I don't think this leads automatically to World 2.0. World 1.0 can still have a lot of responsibility attached to human beings. This isn't really the question. It's more of who is responsible regardless of the freedom levels. Absolute freedom does not exist, and nor does absolute control. If there is a world where both responsible bots and responsibilities would exist together, that would be the best option. But that choice isn't presented. This is a question that creates a false dichotomy and a false dilemma.
If the engineers intervened and changed the bad consequence of a bad act, would the bots still be free to make that act?
Yes, they still made a choice. My kids did this a lot when they were made bad choices, and I mitigated the consequences. They still learned, and the lesser consequences still taught them better courses of action. The consequence that actually takes place having no bearing on whether the choice was made in the first place.
Where did the evil and suffering come from?
The engineers, they are the ones who created the situation where evil and suffering could possibly exist, so they are the ones who are responsible. In your analogy, it could be argued that the code isn't perfect in the first place, which would allow the errors for the bots to crop up in the first place in your 2.0 world. That's on them for creating a situation and or bad design and willfully introducing bad design later so the simulation wouldn't be boring.
Where did goodness come from?
Also the engineers. Hey, if their responsibility on them is how they created things, and they also get credit when things go right, whatever that means. The bots are simply not free enough to get all the credit. In order for anyone to be consistent on question 4 and 5, they have to give the same answer. In this case, the engineers created the possibility for good and evil, so they get the credit or blame for all of it, depending on which way it goes.
Let's just say all the bots freely chose to follow the protocols, or him. Would there be any evil and suffering?
That would depend on what is in the protocol. If it is do good and do no harm, no, there wouldn't be any evil choices or unnecessary suffering, but that assumes the protocols are given by God, which assumes divine command theory is true, which I don't think it is, and that those protocols are perfect, which clearly, given your analogy, they were not, or errors in the system crashes wouldn't be possible in the first place. There's a lot of assumption of your religion, particularly Christianity, behind this question, and I reject a lot of the assumptions you make here. So I'm going to invalidate the question.
Who decides what their eternal destination is?
What?
I mean, the engineers are clearly at their destination. The choice is irrelevant to them. The bots are constant playthings of the engineers, but ultimately the engineers are already where they are and will remain there for the rest of the time. Okay. The engineers decide what bot has followed them correctly enough to earn World 1.0 for free. Sorry, the engineers set the requirements, so they're the ones ultimately responsible for the eternal destination of even the bots. They could change the requirements so more people could get in or different people could get in. It's their game, so they decide the winners and losers in the end. They could, after all, run 1.0, realizing outcomes are not a machine given like quality inherently, given inherent individuality and the fact that moral choices can vary in their goodness, that there's a relative value judgment of what constitutes good, better, and best. Given that they ran 2.0 and decide that justice is absolute and then waive bot responsibility for simply just follow me and said, yeah, the people who create the rules are the ones ultimately responsible for deciding who won and lost and what the rewards and punishments for winning and losing are.
Where would the bots be without the engineers?
Non-existent.
What was the engineers' intent for creating the whole thing?
Well, they seem to have multiple intents depending on what scenario we're running. That seems to be the confusing thing in the analogy overall. In 1.0 world, the idea was no moral evil, and they got what they intended, and they were very successful at it. But it was boring to them, so we have to inject the fact that part of their intention was that the world had to be entertaining. And so they were going to inject into 2.0, we're going to add the possibility of disease, killing billions, genocide, child cancer, murder, sexual assault, etc., etc., etc. Those and many more would make the world more entertaining. So part of their objective seems to make sure that the world is entertaining. The idea of a greater good is also presented here, but that has the inherent flaw of a subjective assessment. The engineers mainly seem to be running experiments, wanting to see what happens. Freedom is proposed, but is it actually a free choice that the gun of hell is put to your head and you can't win because of the flawed programming of the engineers, which doesn't allow you to escape the fact that you're going to do more evil than good by the theology? The engineers really are not analogous to God at all at this point, which is why the argument fails to deal with the problem of evil as it relates to an omni-God proposed. The engineers are not like that God at all. They don't have all knowledge, or they would know the results without having to run the simulation in the first place. While it is claimed that they have all power over the bots, they don't demonstrate any empathy for those bots. And they allow the failure and bots' death at an early age in order to get around this greater good. Very Thanos-like at that point, if you ask me. In some ways, the engineers seem to be very much like the God of the Bible, with their lack of empathy and their lack of concern for human life, as humans seems to be very expendable. Their bots are expendable. But the issue of the problem of evil is evil in relationship to an omni-God. The engineers do not do this perfectly, and this is where the video breaks down in describing the God that supposedly people believe in. The engineers might be all-powerful, but they certainly don't know everything that is going on. They are said to, but then some of the conclusions drawn don't make that possible. But they certainly don't demonstrate being all-loving to every single bot or the whole of bot kind, as some bots are simply expendable to bring out this greater good. In addition, they don't seem to know the outcomes of the various scenarios they run, but have to run them in order to find out. So this makes them a very open theist view of God being analogized, so supposedly we could allow it. But their purpose seems to change given what the scenario is they are running. And that's what makes this whole video a little bit confusing and why this question is hard to answer if I based it on the video content. So, yeah, I very much like the biblical God, so fair point.
And finally, how would you have done it differently?
What would I do differently? I would run World 1.0, recognize that even without unnecessary suffering and moral evil choices, you can still have a lot of choices, growth, and development. There are other needs such as self-actualization and self-esteem that would still be inherent to the bots that would remain throughout their entire lifetime. And their lifetime would be long indeed if there's no death and suffering. This will require overcoming the limitations of ignorance, power to overcome circumstances, resources that are still scarce if the world starts out the same. So I would do a World 1.1 in a sense, realizing that suffering is not necessary to create art, culture. A search for truth that leads to philosophy and science would still be inherent in it. The big thing is that religion would not develop, as it would become unnecessary. The bots would have a very realistic view of the world because that would be the truth. No religion, that would be helpful. But getting back to IMBeggar's original question in the title, why would God, allow for evil and then allow it to run? The answer seems to be from him it would lead to a greater good, but that has its theological problems. Because then how is the fall if not a better outcome is going to be achieved through engaging the knowledge of good and evil and sin? You're basically making sin into a good thing at that point. In order to say that the fall is the fall, you're going to have to get back to your original world. What if, and the question for the Christian theologian is, what if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned? How would this have been better than the fall? Because that's what you need to do in order to make the fall the fall. And what you end up with is, World 1.0, that's heaven. That's paradise on earth achieved by Adam and Eve and their descendants. If that's not good because it's boring, that kind of creates some theological problems. Two, if God is like the engineers, then he isn't able to know exactly what would happen and has to run the simulation to find out. But that makes God into an open theist God, and I think that's problematic as well, because it kind of diminishes the omni-God and it doesn't address the omni-God and the problem of evil situation. Well, it does, but in order to do it, it has to diminish the knowledge of God in order to make that possible. So, good, I guess. That's kind of my thoughts on this video. I think it derailed early because of his really bad consideration of what a world without moral evil and suffering would be like. Because there's still choices, there's still individuality, there would still be a search for truth and meaning. human beings kind of have that inherent to them, trying to find some reason to live, trying to find some way to go forward, which I think is very possible in this life. But at the same time, you have to, deal with the fact that there's a lot of choices. I mean, he literally talks about how this society would develop and grow, but then completely ignores the fact that somehow you'd have to get past certain problems and human limitations and limitations of the world. I mean, just the economic issue of scarcity and the human limitation of not being all-powerful, being inherently ignorant because we can't know everything. Our limitations would cause us to still have problems in getting to our needs of self-actualization and self-esteem, and even relationship issues would still be affected. These are all things that are a little bit higher on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but because we have better moral choices, we can eliminate the safety, security, and physical needs, maybe not even all those completely, given the law of scarcity from an economic point of view. So the point is that what Beggar fails to do, understand that there's still a lot of choices without morally evil. He kind of creates this black and white fallacy right out the gate, and he becomes the king of the false dichotomy. Even in his quizzes, he's dealing with that, giving me two choices, and I'm like, oh, there's a third option, or I think the question is invalid because it's a false dichotomy. You saw me kind of do that through answering the questions. So my final eval on this is he failed to address the problem of evil as it stands. I mean, I get to him, it's probably a good explanation, but it's a horrible explanation, and it creates a lot of problems for Christian theology, the way he explained it. So, how is the fall better? God punishes Adam and Eve for the fall because it was a bad thing for them to do, but it somehow leads to a better, greater good outcome than if they had been obedient in the first place. That would be a good theological question that this stirs up. So in my opinion, at that point, if that's the case, then God has to have sin and he has to cause evil in order to bring about this greater good. And that's problematic for Christian theology that wants to say that the fall is a bad thing. Well, that's kind of it for me. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. I'm very interested in your comments on this video, so comment away. As always, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. There's many ways to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion. I have my PayPal link in the description if you want to support me directly. But I also, there's super chat, super thanks through YouTube, and of course membership, which is the best way to support any content creator that you like. Become a member of their channel. In this case, becoming a citizen of the Rabyd Nation by buying your citizenship. There's different levels for that and different perks. You can check that out by hitting the join button, because membership allows me to worry less and less about the YouTube algorithm, although I'm always going to probably worry about it. And more about creating the content that you enjoy and love. It really does my heart a lot of good and my mentality a lot of good, all the support I've been getting through membership. Thank you very much. And to all those members, to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens, and to my tribunes, thank you very much. Appreciate all of you. You're awesome. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around. So take all your time, money, and opportunities and spend them in a way that builds yourself, builds up the relationships with the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.